Take it easy, dude, but take it. You know, music, all of these Pythagorean insights into order, I think, come out of this herding, domesticated animal husbandry, we call it husbandry, because it's a model of caring for nature. And these ideas are the inspiration and the purpose, to my mind. I mean, the social purpose, because I can, you know, get rid of my stuff and feel better about how I was abused in childhood and this and that and the other thing with psychedelics. But that's all personal growth stuff. But an idea, you know, can be shared. You can take it and you can lay it at somebody's feet. And where do they come from? You know, when you ask the question, where do the ideas come from? This is Platonic Philosophy 101, ladies and gentlemen. This is why the Greeks gave up fishing, to discuss this problem. Where do the ideas come from? And we are no closer to understanding that. And yet the ideas are the signposts of our destiny. They guide us forward, and yet we know not from whence nor whither. Well, I think now, you know, so Plato's take on that was, he said, well, there must be a perfect world somewhere where all these things exist in some, and the numbers and everything, there's a perfect form for everything in a higher dimensional world called the archetypes. Well, 2,000 years of philosophical sophistication have shown certain problems with that point of view, but fewer than you might think. I mean, the mystery of form, the problem of form, what is it? Where does it come from? What sustains it? We are nothing more than form. If it weren't for form, we would be no different than the dirt under our feet. And form intrudes into matter, and then it withdraws. And when it withdraws, they put you in a hole and put dirt on top of you. So it's very important to understand, what is this coming and going of form? If we take this pillow and saw it in two, it's a pretty undramatic event. If we take one of us and saw us in two, it's an extremely dramatic event. And what is the difference there? It's that this object is three-dimensional, and this object is four-dimensional. This object has a quality about it called being alive. Being alive, also technically known as metabolism, means that material is moving along temporal gradients within the confines of this organism. Material is not moving along any gradients within this thing. It's just where it is. There it sits. But in here, a form is being maintained from within. And if I were to die, the form would collapse. Here, no form is being maintained except the form imposed. This is an imposed form. It has no sense of itself, and it doesn't sustain itself from any kind of internal integrity. But higher dimensional objects, like animals and plants and human beings, have this quality. Well, so then what we've been talking about here, albeit sloppily, is the fact that we seem to occupy a higher dimension in the natural order than other things. And this higher dimension has to do with the fact that we have a little piece of mind, a little chunk of this higher order organization. Well then, going toward that, as visionaries, as users of psychedelics, society keeps adjusting its trim tabs, as it were, to mirror this transcendental goal. And this is what we want to become. We want to become like the sensed object in our imagination. And shamanism is a pipeline about this. It's almost as though the end state, well, here's a model for it. It's almost as though the ordinary causal flow of information from the past to the future must make a place for like a 3 to 5% backward flow. And this is what we call intuition. It's that vague, unformed knowing that comes without any baggage of causal mechanism, but it's true knowledge. You know how it's going to be. Well, it may be that time is somehow information permeable, that future potential states of existence are actually somehow in resonance with states of existence in the present and in the past. Our models of how the world works are very, very simple. I mean, basically we operate with mechanical push-pull models that are appropriate to very simple mechanical systems. And yet we know that we are far more complex even than the most complex physical systems. Like this last 15,000 years has been something, and the last 500 years has really been something. It's so close now, the transcendental object, that it informs everything. The metaphor, the model to hold on in your mind as you gaze at the earth in its travail is the metaphor of birth, not death. That a gestation process of 20,000 years is coming to an end. Culture using, language using, minded creatures are coming to some kind of fermentative climax. And we cannot extrapolate the human career on this planet centuries into the future. It ain't going to be like that. It's an absurd question to ask the question, what will the world be like in 500 years? What the world will be like in 500 years is unimaginable, because in the next 40 years, we are going to pass through this quantized transition where we actually become insiders and players in the game. History is a state of becoming. It's a state of moving from the inarticulate, unreflecting, animal style of organization to the self-reflecting, minded, conscious, energy-controlling style. But to get from one to the other takes about 20,000 years, and it's a bitch. You don't know where you are. You don't know up from down. You cannot tell what is happening. There's just migrations and warfare and pogroms and gene mixing and hysteria of every sort and Messiah this and religion that, and they're slaughtering these people and these people are doing that. And it's like a bad dream. It's like a psychedelic trip is what it's like. It's a 15 to 25,000 year dash to authentic being from the animal body. And it would have been a lot easier to understand if 10,000 years ago we hadn't cut the telephone wire to nature. Because from then on we haven't been able to figure out what's going on. And it's been left to men with large egos to figure out what was going on. And what they figured out was going on was that there was a lot of free women, land, animals, and money that needed to be organized for their pleasure, because they lost the connection to this planetary birth process. Now, and like a birth process, I mean, the metaphor is worth pursuing, because a birth is violent, blood is shed, there's moaning and groaning and thrashing around, and yet this is not an automobile accident. This is not a human tragedy. This is how life works. This is centrally scripted in to how human beings operate. If this didn't happen, we wouldn't be here. Well, and yet, if you've ever been pregnant or been around a pregnant person, this is a wonderful state of equilibrium, of self-satisfaction, of completion, and yet the very fact that it exists ensures that it's going to be rent, it's going to be torn, it's going to end violently in separation of these two beings. But then there are all kinds of births. There's stillbirth, the most disturbing and unsettling of all. There's, breech. There's cesarean. There's bad presentation. There's easy labors, hard labors. And I think this is the choice that we still have some choices left. And a choice still to be made is it going to be a hard labor or an easy labor? It's how fast we educate ourselves. That's the lubrication in the birth canal of this pup. How fast we educate ourselves. Are we going to fight it, or are we going to go with it? And it's really frightening. I mean, because what we want is, first of all, forgiveness for what we've done, which ain't likely to come. And then we want to go back and paint ourselves blue and be tribal and turn our back on all of this. But I don't think it's going to be like that. It's propelling us to some kind of higher order. The faith is that history must have been for something, and that everything is to be knitted together, and everything is to be reborn anew. And I don't think this is not a religious doctrine exactly. It's more like the biological faith. I mean, we see it everywhere. We see it in the birth that I was just describing. We see it in the metamorphosis of insects. Heraclitus said, "Puntit rea," all flows. And I think that this is the hardest thing to learn. It certainly has been the hardest thing for me to learn in my life. And I assume then, by extrapolation, maybe this is one of the hard things to come to terms with. Everything flows. Nothing lasts. I mean, not the travail, not the horror, not the women you love, not the women who drive you crazy, not the children you love, not the children that drive you crazy. Everything is in the process of changing into something else, even at the very moment that you recognize its coherence as an entity. And this is the bad news that the ego doesn't want to hear. This is what the ego is created to deny, because the ego is, it's the effort of flesh to make diamond, and it can't be done. You cannot make an indestructible, adamantine, clear substance. It can't be done. But it's all tied up with our fear of death. We assume that if we release ourselves into this flow, we will be swept away, that our identity will cease to exist, that we will somehow not be there. This is an artifact of language. It's a horrible misunderstanding about who we are and how the whole system is working.
You're describing consciousness of our consciousness as being in need of a lack of individuation.
Well, it's the issue between individuation and ego. And I think your question implies a confusion of the two. I mean, we glory in our individuality, our uniqueness, our specialness. But the ego is something else. The ego is something which seeks to actually empower itself at the expense of other people. And so, there has to be a trade-off. I think the glory of Western civilization is our empowering of our uniqueness, the unique artistic vision, the unique scientific vision. The appalling thing about Western civilization is how we have, taken the worst aspects of dominator society and institutionalized it, and then passed laws which make it almost impossible to overturn it. So I'm not preaching any form of anthill, fascist or communist or otherwise, but I do think that we over-identify ourselves with things. We over-identify our happiness with objects. One of the great things about psychedelics that is so corrosive to capitalistic values is that psychedelics show you that the best stuff is in your own head. Better than walking down Madison Avenue looking in the windows is sitting in your shabby apartment on 6 dried grams looking in the windows.
When you talk about a transcendental object, things like that.
Well, obviously the world arrives at the surface of your skin as one thing, and then it enters into perceptual channels of distinction. The eyes bring you some data, the ears bring you data, and the idea is that within the brain all these channels are supposed to be recombined to give you the original input. And apparently this is a culturally defined undertaking. In other words, when you think you're thinking the way people have always thought. But in fact, how people think is very much dependent on media and informational biases in the society in which they were raised. I believe most Western people hear themselves think. In other words, they hear the equivalent of a voice speaking in their head, and it speaks their thoughts. When you smoke halfway decent pot or take psychedelics or something like that, you become aware that the processing of incoming audio data shifts slightly toward the visual, and you see what people mean, or their speech seems more colorful. It seems to convey more. And I think whether we process incoming speech by the ear or by the eye internally is a cultural piece of cultural conditioning. And that, in fact, we are in the act of changing over. That, this generation of young people who are always dissed as illiterate are, in fact, print illiterate. But they know more about electronic literacy than the people who are knocking them. And their bias is primarily toward the eye rather than the ear. That's why what we really have are two cultures talking past each other. And I think that psychedelics sort of strip out culturally conditioned styles of sensory processing, and that what we call hallucinations are nothing more than our thoughts beheld to some degree, and that we're not used to beholding our thoughts. We're used to hearing our thoughts. Are nothing more than our thoughts beheld to some degree, and that we're not used to beholding our thoughts. We're used to hearing our thoughts. The question is, talk about time speeding up. Maybe we're experiencing the rapture right now. Well, in a sense, that's what I was hinting at. History is a very low-volume version of the rapture. And the 20th century is a slightly higher volume of the rapture. And, the year preceding concrescence will be yet more like the rapture, and the minutes preceding concrescence, probably hell, it will be the rapture. The universe is seeking some kind of completion at a very, very rapid state, and clearly technology is now what is driving it. For a long time it was driven by chemistry, and then 1.3 billion years ago, it began to be driven by genetics. Biology became the carrier of change on this planet. 20,000 years ago, it moved into what some people call the epigenetic domain. That means change not in the genes,
Writing is an epigenetic behavior. Language is an epigenetic behavior. Painting, dance, language, possibly borderline, quasi-genetic, quasi-epigenetic, as Chomsky implied. The thing that we're not coming to terms with, because it's almost literally, it's unthinkable, is that history is a birthing process. History is a very dramatic, painful, sudden episode where you begin at the top of the birth canal and you're a cheerful nomad herding your cattle across the African plains, worshiping a mother goddess, having your orgies, having your intoxications, so forth and so on. That's us at the top of the birth canal 18, 17, 16,000 years ago. Now, we are at the narrow neck, and we feel like we're being squeezed to death, suffocated. There is not enough water, there is not enough air, there is only pressure, 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 pressure. And how, in this moment of cumulative global crisis, can we imagine that this is simply a passage to a wider domain of being, as different from the world we have known as this world is from the amniotic oceans of the womb. But humanness survives. Humanness is fully present in the womb, fully present in the world, makes the transition through the narrow neck of the birth canal, and we will make the transition, I am confident, through the narrow neck of modern history and into this wider post-historical domain. How much of our foolishness, our religions, our prejudices, our habits, we will be able to take with us into that new domain? We don't know. We'll be lucky if we get to keep the body. And I'm for that. But I'm also completely aware it may not go according to my wishes. There may come a moment when there are levels of surrender that are trying to the most crazed among us. But nature is clearly now in the third and final act of her love affair with complexity. And our cultures, our technologies now have such a momentum for the production of this kind of complexity that political decisions hardly matter anymore. That's become a sideshow, and driven by money and scientific understanding, technology has taken the lead. And by technology, I don't mean simply machines. I use McLuhan's definition. Technology is simply the extensions of man. The extensions of man. We are hardwiring the unconscious. We are shrinking the planet to a point. We are democratizing the availability of data. We are digitalizing our past so that it doesn't decay, and we are triangulating and anticipating our future and discovering it as we live into it to be more fun than we ever dared imagine, more psychedelic than we ever dared imagine. And I look for this to continue until it just reaches excruciating levels. You put it very well. We are in the shadow of the rapture that is the end of history. And this is the end of this little get-together. Thank you very much.
Yesterday I was pleading for Occam's razor, clear thinking, rules of evidence, because, if hearsay and excited rumor is all it takes to sway you toward believing in a 12th planet or aliens trading coaxial cables for fetal tissue or all this other stuff, then you're just going to be a victim. You're going to be a mark. Somebody's picking your pocket. We can do better than that in the great centers of academic thinking and technical innovation than to spawn, people who support unanchored and unhinged and tasteless and over-designed speculation.
Well, first of all, let me comment on the Buddhist thing. I'm not that friendly to that formulation because it still is postponing gratification. It's saying death is the bouquet of life, you should live toward death. I would say the bouquet of life is this moment. But to the more important point of longevity, I certainly am not interested in living forever, whatever that might mean, because I suspect if you live forever, you miss the point. In other words, I think you miss the bouquet. On the other hand, I don't see anything wrong with, well, no, that's too much to say. The only problem I have with living past whatever, 70 is you do get into political issues of are people buying time at the expense of somebody else. One of the weirdest things about this culture is we've invented a sin for which there is no name. It's so beyond most people's ability to conceive. And this sin that we've invented is we steal the future from our children. We do it with our medical health care plans where we know that all this fine surgery and stuff that you're getting is at the expense of the next generation of people. We overuse resources, leaving nothing for future generations. I don't know how that would all be sorted out. I am attracted by the idea of living as long as I want to live. I wonder how long that would be. And of course, if you make people comfortable, probably they would like to live a lot longer. What reason is there for a person to check out of a comfortable situation? In a sense, what nature does is make the body a less and less comfortable place to be until finally you just say, all right already, beam me up, Scotty. But then, the other possibility is, what if there were forms of existence that were dematerialized? How would we feel about going into circuitry for a few rounds of eternity? And what are the moral implications of that? I don't know. I've had this argument with Robert Anton Wilson. He's a big enthusiast for life extension. It depends on what you think death is. And I've managed to talk myself into the idea that death is probably not simply dissolution and chaos, not because I have received any guidance from on high, but just as I observe nature, she has a wonderful parsimoniousness about her behavior. And clearly this form, which is basically an unraveled DNA molecule that is now making a lot of claims on resources in the environment in order to keep this body going, nature put a lot of effort into this. And I think that the best model for what life is, based not on religious thinking but on biological thinking, is life is what you get when a hyperdimensional object protrudes into ordinary space. In other words, if we take this cup and cut it in two, it doesn't change. It just becomes a cup in two pieces. But it doesn't bleed, it doesn't rot, it doesn't lose its essence. If we take any living being, from a bacterium to a brontosaur, and cut it in two, the entire system falls apart very quickly, and we've created a mess, and we see that the thing that we had is no longer there. So I think what biology is the intrusion into three-dimensional space and time of hyperdimensional objects. And the other clue to that seems an argument for it, is that we do have this thing called a mind, but we can't find it anywhere. It doesn't seem to be anywhere. Even when you get down to the level of electrodes in the brain and saying words to people and watching oscilloscopes, you still can't seem to quite nail it down. So I think probably these objects retract back into hyperspace, higher space, and that this is what the soul is. The soul is there is something to this idea of a morphogenetic field, and we clothe ourselves in matter, but we are not matter. And so to actually complete a human cycle of existence, you have to go into death. It's where you came from, in some sense. I mean, we put a lot of attention into death. We don't look very much at birth. We think we understand it. I mean, we all know the story about the sperm and the egg and all that. But before that, what is going on? You know, whence cometh these forms? We seem to have the matter down pretty good. But really what a being is the intrusion into space-time of a form, and the form is unique, and then it retreats. I think it would be one of the great jokes of human history if here at the end of the 20th century, at the end of the millennium, with all this techno hypola surging around us, if we were to actually gain insight into the after-death state. And one of the reasons I'm so keen for DMT is because when I have given it to people who were purported experts in the after-death state, Tibetan lamas and shamans and this sort of thing, they come back and they say, yep, that's the territory, all right. And so in my highest states, I have had the insight, which I will convey to you without saying it's true, that this is the most limited form of existence you will ever know. You can't be deader than this. This is the bottom line. And so the good news is it's only up from here. But of course you have to bet the farm on this cheerful rap. And there's no whining if you're wrong. This is an all or nothing bet, and so naturally it brings your heart into your throat. But that's the kind of enterprise life is. All risk and the race to the swift, I think. One last. Well, I don't know. And I wonder what I will think as I approach the great divide. It's easy in the pink of health to speculate and play the philosophe and all that nonsense. But, you know, the last dance you dance alone, and nobody will be watching. But I have seen people die, and it is an inspiration. I hope to have that equanimity of mind. The other thing about death that needs to be said is we all imagine, I think, that we will have a leisurely philosophical death. That's what we all want, you know. Months to get used to the idea, to say goodbye, to gather friends, to make our bequeathments, to speak our final wisdom, and, you know. But death for most people comes messily and unexpectedly. And so I don't think you should live in an anticipation of the drama of your deathbed scene. Better to repair to the moment. You know, being a realist primarily, what I find always waiting when I return from these flights of philosophical fancy is and imagination is my body, my history, my space, my time. And these things are all good. It's a great space, a great time, a great body, a great being to be. So the real message of the psychedelic experience and of the anti-historical thrust of the critique we've been carrying out here is to take the moment, the felt presence of immediate experience. This is all you know, it's all you will ever know. Everything else comes as unconfirmed rumor, innuendo, unrealized possibility, fading memory, conjecture, lie, hope, who knows. But in the moment of being, we have the completion of being. It is always complete, every moment. And to the degree that we force ourselves to look beyond it or cannot find ourselves within it, we betray it. And then we have more work to do.
What we call history is the fall out of a dynamic here and now feeling-toned relationship with our environment and into, this anticipation of the future, worry about the past, basically ego. And I recently spoke in New York, and New York is a very nuts and bolts kind of town. And people there took issue with the notion that all of our problems can be boiled down to a single problem. If you trace the thread of every screw-up back into the maze, it all comes back to a single issue, which is excess of ego. We all have excess of ego. And our entire situation, legalistic, psychological, religious, everything is about this, that it doesn't work. It's maladaptive, and yet we have it. And why do we have it if it's maladaptive? If it doesn't promote human values, then how in the hell did it get started, and what is it that's maintaining and sustaining it? Well, this is what I want to talk about over the course of the weekend. When I pushed the analysis of what the psychedelic experience meant to the limits, I was surprised to discover that it left the domain of my personal relationship to the mystery. What is it? What does it want from me? What is it trying to say? All that had to also make room for another issue, which is there's a political issue here. I think most people in this room, most people who have had the psychedelic experience will agree that the most profound, the most open-hearted, the most moving moments of their lives, some of them have been tied in with those experiences. But we seem unable or unwilling or afraid to extrapolate that conclusion to the notion that this is a general panacea for society, because we cannot conceive that that the solution to a spiritual dilemma could lie in matter. In other words, we ourselves have been infected by the inside-outside matter-spirit dichotomies of the dominator culture. But the notion that man, notice the gender thrust here, the notion that man could somehow bootstrap himself to Godhead without reference to nature seems to me highly peculiar and simply nothing more than an expression of hubris, pride, a belief, that we can do it our way and alone. So all of this is very, the shelf life is short on all of these issues because the planet is in a state of terminal crisis. Does that have anything to do with the psychedelic experience, or are these separate issues? How can they be separate issues if the psychedelic experience is a mirror of the state of the individual and collective psyche, and if the planet is on a collision course with some kind of terminal crisis? It seems to me then that nature is struggling to right this disequilibrated planetary ecosystem. So in a sense, there is nothing to be done except to watch and wait. But on the other hand, we are not apart from nature. We are, in some sense, a portion of nature which is the most reactive and energetic, because we are reactive and energetic in the domain of epigenetic codes. We can foment rapid change. Until recently, it was a truism of thinking about society that all change had to be gradual. This myth has now been exploded. We know that, you just take them all out and hang them, and then that's not gradual, and then you've got a new world. And this has been done in several places with excellent success recently. So change need not be gradual. And in fact, I think we're entering into a historical domain where very little change will be gradual. Gradual change was a luxury of the past.
The question relates to an incident told about in both my book with Dennis, Invisible Landscape, and in True Hallucination. Creatively agitated under the influence of mushrooms, announced that he could do something, which is very hard to describe what it was. It was sort of like turn himself inside out, trigger the end of the world, open a doorway into hyperspace, something like that. Anyway, some highly touted, dramatic thing. He organized an experiment to test the theory, and the result of the experiment was not nothing, which was what I was betting on, not what he said would happen, which what he was betting on, but a very peculiar incident then was generated where he seemed to lose his mind, to put it simply, for about 3 weeks, but in a very specialized and orderly way. And I seemed to also undergo a parallel but different kind of transformation. And the theory that was being manipulated was a theory that involved using vocally produced tones to acoustically cancel metabolizing psychedelic molecules in the body so that they would bond as dimers into DNA. In other words, so that they would intercalate into DNA. The hypothesis which lay behind all this was that DNA must be the storage, the physical storage site for memories. This is not a popular idea. This is a sneered at idea. But memory is a great problem for modern science. We've decoded DNA, we've got the top quark, we've measured the core temperature of Betelgeuse. We have no idea how memory works. It's absolutely confounding because a woman, a man of 90 years old can remember the way their great-grandmother's skirts smelled when they used to crawl up into her lap when they were 4 years old, it was 86 years ago. During that time, every molecule in the body has been cycled out every 5 to 7 years. So it's 10 bodies away is the body that crawled up into that woman's lap and could smell the starch in her skirts, and yet the memory is completely clear. Where are the memories? And as you know, experiments have been done with ablating large parts of the brain or studying people who are the unfortunate victims of very traumatic head injuries. And there are cases in the medical literature of people who have fully 80% of their physical brain destroyed and no memory impairment whatsoever. So where are the memories? Well, there are a number of theories, but there is nothing more than theory at this point. Dennis said, let's assume nature is conservative for a moment. We know that nature stores protein code in DNA, and we know that DNA has large silent portions, and in fact some of you may have seen the data which came out just recently, that those large silent portions of the DNA exhibit the same mathematical properties as language. Did you all read this? Oh, this is hot news, folks. As you know, DNA codes for protein. That code is only about 6% of the DNA chain. The rest of the DNA, the other 94%, is called silent DNA, or by some people, junk DNA, because it doesn't code for proteins. So what does it do? Well, recently they've been sequencing this junk DNA and then studying it with algorithms used by the CIA to detect code in noise, and they discover that the silent portions of the DNA fit all the necessary criterion of language. They have syntactical structure. This seems to support Dennis's contention, which was, and it's very it would be very controversial, you see, because it's a Lamarckian mechanism. It's saying that experience can modify nuclear DNA, which is denied by anti-Lamarckian evolution. That's not the way it's supposed to work, according to Darwin and the neo-Darwinians. Nevertheless, if we don't believe that the only part of the body which is not traded out many times over the course of a long lifetime, the only part of the body which you are born with and die with is neural DNA. Neural DNA, what you're born with, you keep. Therefore, it's reasonable, following good scientific method, to hypothesize that the neural DNA must be where the memories are. Well, then Dennis's idea was that ordinary experience has to do with serotonin dropping into a relationship of bonding with DNA and giving off a signal, like a radio transmitter, of the structural hyperfine ESR of the DNA, and that then constitutes the electrobiochemical foundation of the experience of thought. And so what he was saying was then what these psychedelics are is they're like different kinds of transmitters, stronger, or transmitting in different wavelengths, or transmitting with a higher bandwidth. And it is known, in fact, that these psychedelic molecules do compete with serotonin. They are serotonergic competitors. So visualize the DNA in the course of metabolism unfolding and folding itself to expose various runs of nucleotides to ribosomal coding into RNA. And in this molecular environment, these drug molecules are whirling around, and by Brownian motion or by enzymatic delivery, the details don't matter, these molecules intercalate, meaning they slip neatly between the nucleotides. Many drugs do this. This is known. But most drugs or compounds, when they intercalate into DNA, they distort the twisting of it, and it's dysfunctional. It messes up. The thing can't transcript anymore. These drug molecules, if you look at them, they're usually a pentexyl five-sided central group with two benzene rings, or a benzene ring and a partial benzene ring hanging off of this thing. And they're flat, they're planar. It means if you could blow up a psilocybin molecule to the size of a cutting board, it would be about as thin as a cutting board, and as wide and as long. Those flat molecules fit right in between the nucleotides. Yes, and when this happens, the electron spin resonance signal is amplified, just as though a more efficient transceiver had been dropped into place. And you can measure the hyperfine ESR signature of DNA in an in vitro laboratory situation. This is not mysterious. So the idea then is that we have a family of molecules, endogenous neurotransmitters like serotonin, acetylcholine, so forth and so on, and exogenous neurotransmitters like psilocybin, psilocybin, mescaline, and then exogenous endogenous like DMT, found inside and outside the body. And it may be that what the evolution of consciousness is the slow trading in of low-gain molecular transceivers like serotonin for much more broadband, high-gain molecular transceivers like DMT. So Dennis's idea was to take all this theory that I've just laid out and then use acoustically produced vocal sound to cancel the charge of these molecules. And as you probably know, or maybe you don't know, when a molecule becomes superconducting, it will bond into anything. It becomes a hyperbonding molecule. It will bond anywhere. So theoretically, if you could cause psychedelic molecules during their act of being intercalated into your genetic material to become superconducting, even for a moment, they would lock in permanently. And you would begin to have a much deeper experience of consciousness. It would be much broader, much deeper. He claimed he could do this, but he also went further and claimed, and this is where I am not good at explaining it because I didn't understand it then and I don't understand it now, but he claimed that in the act of becoming superconducting and intercalating, this thing would cause the molecule to undergo something which he named. He called it hyperdextrorotation, which means simply that it would turn inside out. And he said then that you would produce something, and, I'm embarrassed at the strangeness of the concept, but that you could, in some sense, give birth to your own soul. That something could be generated out of your body which you would have a high degree of personal identification with, because it would, in fact, be the central essence of yourself. It would be, he made analogies to the Philosopher's Stone, to the flying saucer, to the birth of an idea. It's the idea that you could create what he called translinguistic matter. That means a form of, an ontological form of being which looks like matter, but which behaves like mind. And that somehow this would trigger the collapse of the illusion of history, and everything would be swept into the presence of Almighty God upon her throne or something like that. Anyway, that was the notion. And in proceeding to carry out this experiment, which I just thought was madness and would result in nothing, and then we could go back to botanizing, instead, in a sense, it seemed to work. The condensation of the Philosopher's Stone and the collapse of the historical state vector is slightly delayed, but the rest of it seems right on track, in that when he threw the switch, as he said, the harming switch, he went bonkers, basically, for about 21 days in a very complicated way, which he had anticipated. He said, there is a small chance that I will be turned inside out, not my body, but my mind. And it seemed as though that was precisely what had happened. He could recite the alphabet backwards. He spoke in a language which, if you got him to spell it, you could turn it around and you could see these were full sentences, but spoken backwards. In other words, he truly seemed to be running backwards while the rest of us were running forward. Well, after about 21 days, that faded, and he got his act together and went back to get multiple PhDs in molecular biology, pharmacognosy, and what have you. Coincident with the throwing of the switch, I, who had been the skeptic, noticed that it was as though a switch had been thrown in me, and I began to understand. It was not like any drug I'd ever taken. It was not like psilocybin or ayahuasca. There were no hallucinations. But what began to happen was I simply began to understand faster and faster and faster and faster, so fast that I was just walking around on these jungle trails holding my head going, uh-huh, I see, yes, uh-huh, 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 uh-huh. And it was opening up ahead of me. And eventually this understanding settled down into the theory of the time wave, which I will not slay you with, because this is a course in psychobotany, not a course in megalomania revealed. But what I finally came to rest with was a complete model of space and time, which is what you would end up with if he had succeeded. He said it would condense into three-dimensional space and end history, and everyone would leave their factories and offices and discard their clothes, and with tears of joy streaming down their faces, begin to form the cosmic round dance that precedes the departure for Alpha in Sagittarius. Well, that remains a future promise to be redeemed. But what happened to me was I obtained this strange idea out of the I Ching that offered me a complete model of space and time and the future and the past, and has continued to be the touchstone of my intellectual life. So I think that, we can argue for hours, although it's probably not worth doing, about whether anything at all happened at La Chorrera. I was there. I should mention I didn't sleep for 11 days. And it was the most amazing 11 days I've ever had. I was absolutely ecstatic. I barely ate. And I was full of compassion and understanding for everyone and their limitations in this terrible dilemma, because we were, 1,000 miles up the Rio Baboon asshole with no airplanes and no radios, and here my brother proceeds to go nuts, and I'm saying it's okay, but the world may end in a few days, and on and on. It took me about 5 years to get myself publicly presentable. In that time, I was a burden to my friends and a joy to my enemies, because I appeared to be a social menace. I could back people into a Denny's and hold them there for 16 hours at a stretch with a rap so alarming and appalling that people would just back to the wall to wait to see if I was going to explode. It was simply, it takes a long time. You have to leaven it with humor and self-criticism and convince people that you don't take yourself seriously and all these things to make it palatable. Yeah, that is true hallucination. And I think this, if you want to read an eye-opening book, if you haven't read it, read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Because what you'll learn there, to your amazement, is that these great intellectual breakthroughs like Newton and Einstein and Planck and so forth, they don't come out of careful examination of the evidence and conservative adumbration of theories and all. No, they don't come like that. They come like revelations, completely, and then you argue backward to convince your colleagues. You go out and you get the evidence and you argue backward and you convince everybody, and then everybody says, well, it was obvious all the time, and anyway, they knew it 50 years earlier, and on and on and on. But that's what you have to do. So I have stuck with this, my devotion to psychedelics, because it gave me really my greatest wish, which was I want to have a complete understanding of how things work. That doesn't mean there is no more surprises, but it means you at least have a structure that you can pour it into. And I think this is what shamans do. They create a personal ideology sufficient to their needs, and my needs are complex because I live in a society where I'm going to be talking to quantum physicists, mathematicians, historians of science, epistemologists, so forth and so on. So it had to perform at top speed. If you're in a rainforest situation, in a monoculture, then it is perhaps not so challenging. But the point of all this is catalysis of ideas. Culture can evolve no faster than its language. It can evolve no faster than the models that it can set up for itself to achieve, and that requires language. So I take the psychedelics to be catalysts of language. They probably caused it to come into existence in the first place, and then they continue to push it forward into new domains. And this great period of creativity that we're living through now in the sciences, in the arts, in the implementation of exotic technologies, I think this is the real legacy of the 60s. The people who run these fancy computer companies and the World Wide Web and the net and CERN and all that, they're all freaks. They're all people who came up through the 60s and have somehow fitted themselves in to straight society. But the great bulk of creative work in the society in those areas is being done by people who took psychedelics. And in fact, arguably, the scientists of today, the technological implementers of today, are in fact shamans. And we are creating a kind of culturally validated shamanic superspace, except we call it cyberspace. But all we're doing with the creation of cyberspace is hardwiring in a male way what has always been there in a female way. I mean, the web of invisible hidden associations that make us the cosmos instead of the chaos. Well, that seems to be an overlong answer to a question I've forgotten.